Following the election victory of Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, we have a bit more insight into the likely economic circumstances that Nintendo will be operating in over the coming months. What are the forces affecting decisions, like whether to drop, fix, or raise the Switch 2 price, affecting the sales of accessories, and what is their overall strategy at this time? Well, let's start by looking at Takaichi's victory and its broader impact on Japan to begin with not just a large majority of the seats, but a historic one of more than two-thirds of the seats in the lower house of Japan going to her Liberal Democratic Party. She will have great flexibility to enact her policies over the coming years. It seems highly likely that her spending policies will see inflation continuing in a country where historically inflation has been low or absent, although not necessarily at too high a rate if she can avoid it, but this will likely put downward pressure on the yen in the short to medium term. In the February investor Q&A, Shuntaro Furukawa noted that because foreign components are denominated in dollars rather than yen, subject to their ongoing negotiated contracts with Nintendo of course, the costs to manufacture them rises when the yen weakens. It's also the case that their strong Japanese sales aren't worth as much to them if the yen continues to depreciate, so although there are many advantages to Nintendo of having a weaker yen because the majority of their sales are abroad, there are disadvantages as well. However, this may all have a silver lining for American consumers especially. Since last April, the cost of the Switch 2 has been a topic of concern, as the console has been affected by tariff changes and by rising memory costs. This means that Nintendo's margins are surely far slimmer than they had once intended, and Furukawa has already confirmed that they will be keeping an eye on memory prices in the long term, opening the door to the potential for a price rise. However, in many respects, the exchange rate situation has some benefits for American consumers. The more Nintendo can sell in international markets, the better for them, and the exchange rate will offset some of the additional costs Nintendo are incurring. Of course, Nintendo don't just profit off the hardware itself, but on the ancillary sales as well. It also may have an impact in terms of the stock that they will keep on hand. In the February Q&A, the investors teased out from Furukawa that the company had heavily invested in stock of the Switch 2 going into the winter holiday season, and this explains the gap between 15 million Switch 2s actually sold by the end of December 2025 and the over 17 million that had already shipped to retailers. They explained that this was, as Furukawa put it, within the appropriate range, given that they were also delivering systems for New Year sales, and he also explained that they strengthened their production capability to ship more units than normal to prevent sellouts if sales exceeded expectations. Of course, if the expectation is that the yen will weaken, they might as well pull the trigger on large amounts of stock now and deal with the problem of how to sell them later in the hopes of the dollar being relatively strong, and we'll talk about the logistics of how much they can actually do this in a second. There is of course a limit to how far they can take this strategy though. It's affording them leeway rather than giving them scope to fill their boots. The US administration is also aiming to devalue the dollar in order to boost the country's export market, but is somewhat restrained in doing so due to factors such as its wish to keep the dollar's primacy as the world's major reserve currency, which grants the US various privileges, especially in its ability to run the larger debts. Many other countries are in a similar position, and so Japan may find that the yen's descent is slower or even outstripped by other currencies depending on their specific situations. As Japan relies on foreign imports of food, there is also a risk that price increases are not offset by Takaichi's plan to suspend for 2 years the 8% national consumption tax on food and drink. And indeed, if foreign exchange realities continue to put upward pressure on food and drink costs, the underlying trend could completely offset the cost of the tax reduction and mean that consumers are still not particularly better off. That tax, by the way, is also of interest to Nintendo, as Japan's household spending on food and drink hit a 44-year high recently, taking up over 30% of household spending in 2025 just on food and drink. This, to a large degree, is why the region-locked Japanese Switch 2 is relatively low in price compared to others around the world. As I established in a video last year, this apparently very beneficial arrangement pretty much evaporates when you adjust to cost of living, and Switch 2 remains relatively expensive in Japan. However, the resilient Japanese demand, the possibility of the income tax changes leading to more short-term income for families, and the foreign exchange situation all make it unlikely that Nintendo will need to be quite as aggressive in the domestic market at the present time. Now, against this optimism, a dose of reality from the so-called RAM crisis, the crisis affecting the production of memory. A new report from Counterpoint Research has suggested that RAM prices are now nearly double the equivalent prices a year ago. When Nintendo's current contracts expire, there's likely to be a significant snapback. Now, who knows exactly what the terms of their current deals are, but I'm sure Nintendo will want to maintain the economies of scale of large numbers produced, stay well above their minimum purchase commitments, and who knows, if there is flexibility to increase their production under current terms, it may be very beneficial to push for the maximum contracted volume for the quarter, even if the current sales are not necessarily so promising. Apart from the short-term benefit of doing this, it would also give them more leverage in the long term if they can offer strong volume forecasts going into the next year. Now, price is one problem, but the other is fulfillment. In raw price terms, if we take a recent report that the kind of RAM the Switch 2 appears to have is costing $70, though that's obviously not to say that Nintendo's economies of scale will mean they will pay $70, then if the price doubles again by the end of 2026, it will be difficult to see even higher purchasing offsetting the massive cost increases that would incur, especially given the difficulty of buying in dollars. However, that assumes that Nintendo can even source sufficient quantities, with production likely to be dominated by major rivals like Apple and Android. I noted a Kit and Krista video recently which observed the extent to which Nintendo are now releasing games with ancillary merchandise at launch, such as Amiibo, books, and more. I'll be looking at Amiibo specifically in more depth at some point soon, but my baseline assumption here is that I suspect this strategy isn't just about maximizing the sales per game, but also about ensuring the company against hitting supply issues, as it means that they can continue to sell other items even if they run into problems producing more Switch 2s. While they have confirmed their intention to move past the original Switch in terms of producing new games, I do wonder if they might be more willing to consider games for the original machine, and even to use specific sales devices such as reviving the controversial limited edition strategy they used with Super Mario 3D All-Stars, where the title was only available for 6 months, although they clearly had produced enough copies that the game in reality was available for far longer. While I was skeptical earlier this year about them releasing Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD after Wind Waker was already released on GameCube at NSO, and especially after the Galaxy OnePlus 2 sales seemed a little soft, which might be attributable to the All-Stars pack still having been on sale quite recently, this would be an example of the kind of initiative that Nintendo might be looking for, releasing two relatively high-margin games for a limited time period, even with some kind of collector's edition perhaps to bring sales forward around the current time, and therefore give them some cover if there are any problems with the Switch 2 in terms of either cost or production volume. It would also be a great time to push the boat out on their film aspirations, given that these would likely involve American studios and therefore be denominated in dollars. Obviously, there are many competing considerations here, and I think the standing assumption should be always that Nintendo will try to keep things on an even keel as much as possible. They managed to avoid price rises for the Switch in most territories for 8 years, and that is likely to be their preferred option going forward. I would anticipate them having a high margin of spare stock in reserve at a lot of times, and if that number gets too high, they're likely going to need to radically incentivize console purchases against the backdrop of uncertain economic conditions and a skeptical public. This may involve raising the price and volume of ancillary items and games further. I expect there to be more $80 games this year, but probably an offsetting of the price of the console, trying to keep the console price at a stable rate for as long as they can. Ultimately, they may not be able to avoid price increases to Switch 2, but I don't think they're going to go into them as soon as they can. I really think they will try to hold off at least until August, if not next January. In the big picture, though, we should remember that all these kinds of economic policies can backfire as well as work, and with high debt, low productivity, an aging population, and more bellicose international relations being a difficulty not just for Japan but many Western countries, Nintendo will doubtless seek to maintain their own strong position of having lots of cash on hand and not being overextended or in any way in debt. Ways to manage this might be to slow slightly their until now rapid Japanese expansion and to just consolidate for a while. Of course, this is all quite a fast-moving situation, so I'm sure we will review this in due course. Do hit up the Patreon for early ad-free and exclusive content, including some quite major pieces coming up over the coming weeks. Thank you so much for watching, hyping, liking, and commenting, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.